The early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Martha's downtown diner, casting warm golden squares across the checkered floor tiles. It was just another peaceful Sunday morning, the kind that made you appreciate life's simple pleasures. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the familiar scent of maple syrup and warm toast that had been drawing customers to this spot for over 30 years. James Wilson pushed open the glass door, triggering the gentle chime of the bell above. At 52, he carried himself with a kind of quiet confidence that came from years of military service. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and though his face showed signs of age, his eyes remained sharp and alert. A habit formed from 25 years in the Marine Corps that he couldn't shake even after retirement. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called out Mrs. Chen, the elderly waitress who'd been working the morning shift for as long as anyone could remember. She was already reaching for the coffee pot before he could take his usual seat. "The usual spot's waiting for you." James smiled warmly, nodding to the other regulars as he made his way to his corner booth. Some people might have found it strange that he sat in the same spot every Sunday for the past 5 years, but to him, routine wasn't just habit, it was comfort. The corner booth gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside, another old military habit that had stuck with him. "Thanks, Mrs. Chen," he said as she poured his coffee with practiced precision. The ceramic mug was already waiting on the table, turned to just the right angle so the handle faced outward. These small touches reminded him why he loved this place. "How's that grandson of yours doing in college?" Mrs. Chen's face lit up, the way it always did when someone asked about her family. "Oh, he just made the dean's list, first semester too. He says those study tips you gave him really helped." She paused, her expression softening. "You know, you've done so much for so many young people around here." "My Tommy is just one of many." James waved off the compliment, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. After retiring from the Marines, he'd found his true calling as a youth mentor. Working with teenagers wasn't that different from training young Marines. Both needed guidance, structure, and someone who believed in them. "Just paying it forward, Mrs. Chen. Someone did the same for me when I was young." He took a sip of his coffee, perfect as always. "I'll have the usual breakfast, please." 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit, Mrs. Chen recited with a knowing smile. "Coming right up." As she walked away, James pulled out his worn leather portfolio. Inside were the materials for his upcoming presentation at Washington High School. He'd been invited to speak to the senior class about career opportunities in public service. These talks always brought him back to his own journey, from a kid with uncertain prospects to a decorated Marine Corps veteran. The diner's morning buzz created the perfect background noise as he reviewed his notes. The clink of cutlery against plates, snippets of friendly conversation, and the sizzle from the grill all blended into a familiar symphony. Every now and then, he'd pause to greet another regular customer or exchange a few words with the staff. Bobby, the young busboy who'd started working weekends to save up for trade school, stopped by to refill his water glass. "Mr. Wilson, I got that application filled out for the apprenticeship program you told me about," he said, his voice quiet but excited. Would you mind looking it over when you have time?" "Bring it by next Sunday," James replied with an encouraging nod. "We'll go through it together." He watched as Bobby's face brightened before hurrying back to his duties. These moments, these small chances to guide young people toward their dreams, made every day worthwhile. The morning light had shifted, painting new patterns on the diner floor when Mrs. Chen returned with his breakfast. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the toast was just the right shade of golden brown, and the fruit looked fresh and colorful. She'd added a small extra portion of strawberries, his favorite. "You're too good to me, Mrs. Chen," he said, noticing the extra fruit. She gave him a maternal pat on the shoulder. "You're good to everyone else. Someone's got to look after you too." With that, she bustled off to tend to other customers, leaving James to enjoy his meal in comfortable solitude. As he ate, his thoughts drifted to the presentation materials spread out before him. The laptop he'd brought contained slides showing various career paths in public service, not just military, but police, fire department, emergency services, and community outreach programs. He believed in showing young people all their options, letting them find their own path just as he had found his. The Congressional Medal of Honor sat in its wooden display case, carefully wrapped in soft cloth in his briefcase. He rarely showed it off, but tomorrow's presentation was special. These kids needed to see that greatness could come from anywhere, that circumstances didn't define destiny. The medal wasn't about him, it was about possibility. Regular customers who knew James would never have guessed he was a decorated war hero. They knew him as the quiet man who helped their children with college applications, who organized community cleanup drives, who always had time to listen to someone's problems. His military service was just one chapter in a life dedicated to serving others. A young family walked past his booth, their little girl waving shyly. James waved back, remembering how his own daughter used to do the same at that age. Now she was finishing her residency at a hospital across the country. Times like these made the diner feel even more like home, a place where memories lived alongside the present moment. The morning continued its peaceful rhythm. James alternated between reviewing his presentation, enjoying his breakfast, and exchanging warm greetings with familiar faces. This was his Sunday ritual, as much a part of him as his military training or his commitment to community service. Looking out the window, he watched people hurrying past on their way to church, Sunday shopping, or whatever else filled their weekend mornings. Each person had their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. That's what he tried to teach the young people he mentored, that everyone's journey was unique and valuable. Mrs. Chen stopped by one last time to top off his coffee. "Everything good, Mr. Wilson?" "Perfect as always," he replied, meaning it. The food, the atmosphere, the company, everything about Martha's downtown diner felt right. It was more than just a place to eat. It was a reminder of what community really meant. Little did he know that this peaceful Sunday morning routine was about to be disrupted in a way that would test his patience, challenge his dignity, and ultimately lead to unexpected change in the community he'd grown to love so deeply. The Sunday morning rush at Martha's downtown diner was in full swing. The clatter of plates and cheerful chatter filled the air as families fresh from church services mixed with joggers grabbing post-run breakfasts. Through the large front windows, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the busy street outside. James had just opened his laptop to fine-tune his presentation for tomorrow's high school career day when the bell above the door chimed. 2 police officers walked in, their uniforms crisp and badges gleaming in the morning light. They were young, probably new transfers to the precinct across the street. The taller officer scanned the room with a kind of forced authority that often came with inexperience, while his partner followed closely behind. Mrs. Chen approached them with her usual warm smile, menus in hand. "Welcome to Martha's. Would you like a booth or counter seats?" The officers barely acknowledged her, their attention already fixed on James's corner booth. Something in their expressions made Mrs. Chen's smile fade slightly. She'd worked in diners long enough to sense when trouble was brewing. "Actually," the taller officer said, his voice carrying across the now quieting diner, "we've had some reports of suspicious activity in this area. A few laptop thefts from local businesses." His eyes remained fixed on James and the expensive computer sitting open on his table. The other officer added, "Yeah, we're just doing our duty to check things out." They began walking toward James's booth, their boots heavy against the checkered floor. The regular customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Several people stopped eating, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Bobby, the young busboy, stood frozen by the kitchen door, a bin of dirty dishes clutched to his chest. James looked up from his laptop screen, his face calm but his shoulders tensing slightly. 25 years in the Marines had taught him how to handle tense situations with dignity. He'd faced far worse than this, but something about being singled out in his favorite diner, a place where everyone knew him, made his throat tighten. "Sir," the taller officer said, now standing directly beside the booth, "we're going to need to see some identification." His hand rested casually on his belt, close to his radio. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame somehow filling the space between the officers and the booth. "Officers, Mr. Wilson is a regular customer. He's been coming here every Sunday for—" "Ma'am," the second officer cut her off. "Please step back. We're conducting official business." His tone carried that edge of authority that seemed to demand immediate compliance. James slowly closed his laptop. "Officers," he said, his voice steady and measured, "I've been coming to this diner for 5 years. You can ask anyone here about me. He gestured to the room full of familiar faces, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The taller officer's expression hardened. "Sir, I don't care if you've been coming here since the place opened. We've got reports of stolen laptops, and you match a description we received." He paused, looking pointedly at James's casual weekend attire, a simple polo shirt and khakis. "This is an upscale neighborhood, sir. We need to make sure everything checks out." A woman at a nearby table had pulled out her phone and was quietly recording the interaction. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the pleasant Sunday morning atmosphere completely evaporated. "I'm a retired Marine Corps veteran," James said calmly, though his coffee cup clinked slightly as he set it down. "I have my ID right here." He reached slowly toward his back pocket, making sure his movements were clear and deliberate. The second officer stepped closer, his stance widening. "Keep your hands where we can see them, sir. We'll tell you when to reach for anything." Mrs. Chen's face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. Mr. Wilson mentors young people in our community. He helps students get into college." "Ma'am," the taller officer's voice rose, "one more interruption and you'll be interfering with police business." The diner had fallen completely silent now. Even the sizzle of the grill seemed muted, as if the kitchen staff had stopped cooking to watch the scene unfold. Through the window, a small crowd of passers-by had begun to gather, drawn by the unusually tense atmosphere inside their favorite local breakfast spot. James remained still, his hands visible on the table. Years of military service had ingrained in him the importance of staying calm under pressure. But this was different from anything he'd faced in combat. This was personal, happening in a place he considered a second home, in front of people who knew him as a mentor and friend. "Officers," he tried again, his voice still steady but carrying a weight of authority that came from years of command. "I understand you're doing your job, but I think there's been a misunderstanding here." The taller officer's radio crackled, making several customers jump. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the booth now." Slowly. Bobby the busboy had disappeared into the kitchen, and moments later, the owner of the diner, Mr. Thompson, emerged wiping his hands on his apron. He was a stout man with gray hair and kind eyes that now blazed with concern. "What's going on out here?" he demanded, his usually cheerful voice serious. "Officers, there must be some mistake. James Wilson is one of our most respected customers." The second officer turned to face Mr. Thompson. "Sir, please return to the kitchen. We're handling a potential suspect in an ongoing investigation." James began to slide out of the booth, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. His coffee cup sat half-finished, steam still rising from its surface. The breakfast he'd been enjoying just minutes ago was now cold, forgotten in the tension of the moment. As he stood, his briefcase shifted on the seat, and something inside made a soft thud against the wooden case it was housed in. The sound drew the officer's attention immediately, their postures becoming even more rigid. "What's in the briefcase, sir?" the taller officer demanded, his hand now resting more firmly on his belt. Through the window, more people had gathered to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. The morning sun continued to stream through the glass, creating an almost theatrical spotlight on the unfolding drama. The peaceful Sunday morning had transformed into something else entirely, a moment that would soon challenge not just these two officers' assumptions, but the entire community's understanding of judgment, respect, and the power of hidden truths. And in his corner booth, surrounded by half-eaten breakfast and the familiar warmth of his favorite diner, James Wilson was about to teach everyone present a lesson that none of them would ever forget. The tension in Martha's downtown diner had reached a breaking point. The morning sunlight that usually made the place feel warm and welcoming now felt harsh and exposing. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the corner booth, where James Wilson stood calmly facing the two officers. "Sir, step away from the briefcase," the taller officer commanded, his voice carrying across the silent diner. The breakfast crowds had stopped eating, their forks frozen mid-air, toast growing cold on their plates. Mrs. Chen wrung her hands in her apron, her normally cheerful face lined with worry. She'd served thousands of customers over her years at the diner, but she'd never seen anything like this. "Please," she said softly, "there's really no need for—" "Ma'am, this is your final warning," the second officer cut in. "Step back, or we'll have to ask you to leave your own establishment." James remained perfectly still, Is military training evident in his controlled breathing and steady gaze? "Officers, I understand your concerns," he said, his voice carrying the kind of patience that came from years of handling difficult situations. "But I believe we can resolve this professionally." Through the large diner windows, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Some held phones, recording the scene. Inside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the checkered floor, making the scene feel almost surreal. Bobby, the young busboy, had moved closer to the kitchen door. His hands gripped his cleaning rag so tight his knuckles had turned white. Just last week, James had helped him practice for his college interviews. Now he watched helplessly as his mentor faced this humiliating situation. "Sir, we've had reports of suspicious individuals casing local businesses," the taller officer continued, his hand still hovering near his belt. "High-end laptops have been disappearing. And you match a description we received." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Several regular customers exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen James here every Sunday for years, working on his community outreach programs, helping local kids with their college applications. Mr. Thompson, the diner's owner, stepped forward again. "Officers, this is completely unnecessary. Mr. Wilson is a respected member of our community. He's been coming here for—" "Sir," the second officer interrupted, "this is a police matter. Please step back." James took a slow, deliberate breath. 25 years in the Marines had taught him how to handle pressure, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his Sunday morning sanctuary, the place where he built relationships and helped guide young people toward better futures. "Officers," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made several customers straighten in their seats. "I've dedicated my life to serving this country. I'm happy to show you my ID, but I'd appreciate being treated with the same respect I'm showing you." The taller officer's face tightened. "Sir, your attitude isn't helping the situation. The way you are dressed, the expensive laptop, you have to understand how this looks." A woman at a nearby table couldn't contain herself any longer. "How it looks," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It looks like you're harassing a man who spends his Sundays helping our kids plan their futures." The morning light caught the silver in James's hair as he remained standing, perfectly still, his dignity intact despite the humiliation of the moment. His coffee sat cooling on the table, next to the presentation he'd been preparing for tomorrow's career day at the local high school. "Last warning, sir," the taller officer said, taking a step closer. "Step away from the booth and keep your hands where we can see them." Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes now, but her voice was firm. "He helped my grandson get into college. He volunteers at the community center. Ma'am," the second officer cut in again, "step back now." The tension in the diner was almost unbearable. The gentle music playing from the overhead speakers seemed jarringly out of place, an upbeat oldies tune competing with the heavy silence of the moment. James began to move, his movements slow and deliberate. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "I'm complying, but I'm also going to remember every detail of this interaction." The morning sun caught something metallic on his laptop case, a small Marine Corps emblem that had gone unnoticed by the officers. A few of the regular customers who knew James's background shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the deep irony of the situation. "Sir, hands where we can see them," the taller officer repeated, reaching toward James's briefcase. "We'll need to check what's in here." Just then, the briefcase shifted on the booth seat. The movement caused a small wooden box inside to slide, making a distinct sound against the leather interior. The officers tensed at the noise, their postures becoming even more rigid. The morning sun streaming through the windows had shifted now, casting long shadows across the scene. Outside, more people had gathered, their faces pressed against the glass. Inside, the regular customers watched in stunned silence as the situation continued to escalate. What happened next would change not just this Sunday morning, but the entire community's understanding of judgment, respect, and the price of prejudice. And in that tense moment, as James Wilson stood facing the officers in his favorite diner, none of them could have predicted how this confrontation would transform their understanding of honor, service, and the power of dignity in the face of discrimination. Time seemed to slow down in Martha's downtown diner as the taller officer reached for James's briefcase. The morning sunlight caught the dust motes floating in the air, making them dance like tiny stars in the tense atmosphere. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and someone's coffee cup gently clicking against its saucer. "Sir, step back while we examine the contents," the officer commanded, his hand now on the briefcase's leather handle. The second officer maintained his position, watching James's every movement with trained intensity. Mrs. Chen had covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Bobby the busboy had edged closer, still clutching his cleaning rag like a lifeline. The regular customers sat frozen, their breakfast forgotten, witnesses to a moment that none of them had ever expected to see in their familiar Sunday morning sanctuary. As the officer lifted the briefcase, his movement caused a stack of papers to slide across the table, knocking into James's morning newspaper. The paper slipped to the floor, and in that simple moment, everything changed. The wooden display case that had been partially hidden beneath the newspaper was now fully visible. Its polished surface caught the morning light, and through its glass top, something gold gleamed. The Congressional Medal of Honor sat in its velvet lining, its presence suddenly commanding all attention in the room. The taller officer's hand froze on the briefcase. His partner's eyes widened as recognition dawned on his face. The medal's distinctive shape and blue ribbon were unmistakable to anyone who had ever worn a uniform or served their country. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Mr. Thompson, who had been wringing his hands by the counter, straightened up, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and righteous anger. Several customers who had been filming the incident on their phones moved closer, their cameras now focused on the medal that had silently waited to tell its story. The second officer's voice trailed off, his former authority crumbling in the face of what lay before him. The Medal of Honor was more than just a military decoration, it was the highest recognition of valor that the United States could bestow. Only a handful of living recipients walked among us. James stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he'd endured. The morning sun highlighted the silver in his hair, and for a moment, those who knew him could almost see the young Marine he'd once been, serving his country with distinction in battles they'd only read about in newspapers. "I was planning to show it at Career Day tomorrow," James said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "Sometimes young people need to see that greatness can come from anywhere. That service to others isn't about what you look like, but about what you're willing to give." The taller officer's face had drained of color. His hands slipped from the briefcase as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Years of training hadn't prepared him for this moment, for coming face to face with his own prejudices in such a profound way. Through the diner's windows, the growing crowd of onlookers pressed closer, sensing that something significant had happened. The morning sun had shifted again, now casting long rays across the medal's display case, making it seem to glow from within. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. "Now you see," she said, not unkindly. "Now you see who you've been treating like a criminal. This man has done more for our community, for our country, than most of us could ever dream of doing." Bobby had moved closer to the table, his young face a mixture of awe and fierce pride. Just yesterday, James had spent an hour helping him with his college application essay. The boy's hands had stopped shaking, and he stood straighter, as if some of James's dignity had wrapped around him like a protective shield. The second officer cleared his throat. "Sir, words seemed to fail him as the weight of their actions settled heavily on his shoulders. The medal gleamed silently on the table, its presence a powerful reminder of the courage and sacrifice it represented. An older gentleman in the back of the diner slowly stood up and raised his coffee cup in a silent salute. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap, and his eyes met James's with the understanding that only comes from shared service. One by one, other customers began to stand, not in a showy or dramatic way, but in quiet respect for the man they'd watched being humiliated moments before. The morning light filled the diner now, touching everything with a soft, golden glow. The tension that had filled the air began to transform into something else, a moment of recognition, of truth revealed, of assumptions shattered against the hard reality of who James Wilson really was. James looked at the medal, then back at the officers. His voice remained calm, carrying the same steady authority he'd shown throughout the confrontation. "This medal isn't just about what I did," he said. "It's about what we're all capable of when we look past our fears and prejudices. when we choose to serve something bigger than ourselves. The officers stood rooted to the spot, their earlier bravado replaced by a dawning understanding of the magnitude of their mistake. The metal caught another ray of sunlight, sending a bright reflection dancing across the diner's walls. A silent reminder that truth, like light, has a way of finding its path through any darkness. The bell above Martha's Downtown Diner's door chimed, cutting through the heavy silence. A tall figure in a crisp police uniform stepped in, his silver hair and confident stride marking him as someone used to command. Captain Richardson, the precinct commander, surveyed the scene before him with experienced eyes that missed nothing. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated an extraordinary tableau. Two young officers standing frozen, their earlier authority deflated. A Congressional Medal of Honor gleaming in its display case. And James Wilson, standing with quiet dignity beside his corner booth. "I was hoping I'd find you here, James," the captain said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Didn't expect to find my officers here too." His tone carried a weight that made both young officers straighten instinctively. The captain walked forward, his shoes clicking against the checkered floor. He'd known James for years. They'd first met at last summer's veterans ceremony, where James had given a speech that left half the audience in tears. The memory of that day made the current situation even more painful. "Sir," the taller officer started to explain, but the captain held up his hand. "I just left the community center," Captain Richardson continued, his eyes fixed on James. "The kids there were asking about you. They're excited about tomorrow's career day presentation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Especially since you promised to tell them about your time leading that rescue mission." The two young officers exchanged confused looks. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching everything unfold, couldn't help but smile slightly through her tears. She'd heard bits and pieces of James's story over the years, but had always respected his modesty about his service. "The same mission," the captain continued, now turning to face his officers, "that earned him that medal you're staring at. The one where he saved his entire unit and a village of civilians while wounded himself." His voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. Bobby, the busboy, had stopped pretending to clean and was listening with undisguised awe. Just yesterday, James had helped him with his college application, never once mentioning anything about being a war hero. The taller officer's face had turned a shade paler. "Captain, we were responding to reports of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" The captain's voice was quiet but firm. "Like helping kids with their homework? Or organizing the veterans support group at the community center? Or maybe running the mentorship program that's helped dozens of our own officers' children get into college?" Through the diner's windows, the morning sun cast long shadows across the scene. The crowd outside had grown, their phones still recording everything. Inside, the regular customers watched in silence as years of quiet service were finally brought to light. "3 of your fellow officers," the captain continued, addressing his subordinates, "went through James's youth mentorship program before joining the force. Did you know that? One of them was my own nephew." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The weight of their mistake was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention. "Every Sunday," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion, "Mr. Wilson sits in that booth. He helps anyone who asks. Last month, he spent 3 hours helping my grandson with his college applications. Never asked for anything in return." The captain nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "That sounds like James. Always giving, never wanting recognition." He turned back to his officers. "The same when he was in the Marines. 25 years of exemplary service. Led one of the most successful humanitarian missions in recent military history. And now he spends his retirement serving his community." James remained quiet, his hand resting lightly on the medal's display case. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting the dignity in his bearing that no amount of humiliation had been able to shake. "Captain," he finally said, his voice gentle, "these officers were doing their job. Maybe not in the best way, but they were trying to protect the community. Even now, after everything that had happened, he was trying to build bridges." Mr. Thompson, the diner's owner, had moved closer, his face a mixture of pride and lingering anger. "That's just like you, James. still thinking of others even after how they treated you. The captain looked at his young officers, his expression stern but not unkind. This is what real service looks like, gentlemen. Not just wearing the uniform, but understanding the community you're sworn to protect, knowing its people, respecting their dignity. Through the windows, the morning sun had shifted again, casting new patterns across the diner's floor. The regular customers watched as something profound transformed in the young officers' faces, understanding dawning like the slow rise of a new day. "Sir," the taller officer finally said, turning to James, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." James smiled slightly, the same gentle smile he used when helping young people find their way. "Maybe we can start with a cup of coffee," he suggested, gesturing to his booth. "Mrs. Chen makes the best coffee in town. And I'd be happy to tell you about the youth mentorship program at the precinct. We're always looking for officers who want to make a difference." The morning light filled the diner now, touching everything with a warm glow. What had started as a moment of prejudice was transforming into something else, a chance for understanding, for growth, for change. And in that corner booth, where James Wilson had spent countless Sundays serving his community quietly, a new chapter was about to begin. By Monday morning, the video had spread across social media like wildfire. Phones buzzed with notifications as local news stations picked up the story, their headlines highlighting the dramatic revelation at Martha's downtown diner. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. The police department's phone lines lit up, not with complaints, but with calls from community members sharing stories about James Wilson's impact on their lives. Parents spoke about college acceptance letters their children had received thanks to his mentoring. Former troubled teens, now successful adults, described how his guidance had changed their lives. "I never wanted this kind of attention," James said quietly, sitting in his usual booth on Monday afternoon. The diner had become unexpectedly busy, with people dropping by just to shake his hand or share a word of support. Mrs. Chen had to bring in extra help to handle the crowd. Bobby, the young busboy, moved between tables with newfound confidence. He'd already received 3 calls from local news stations wanting to interview him about what he'd witnessed. "Mr. Wilson taught me that standing up for what's right doesn't always mean raising your voice," he told a reporter. "Sometimes it's about staying calm and showing people a better way." The 2 young officers hadn't hidden from the situation. Instead, they'd done something unexpected. They'd asked to meet with James again, this time to learn. Captain Richardson had watched with pride as they sat in that same corner booth, notebooks open, listening intently as James shared his vision for building bridges between law enforcement and the community. "We got it all wrong that day," the taller officer admitted, his former arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "But Mr. Wilson showed us what real leadership looks like. He turned our mistake into a chance to make things better." The diner's regulars watched as something remarkable began to unfold. What could have become a story of division instead became a catalyst for change. James's youth mentorship program, which had been operating quietly for years, suddenly had a waiting list of police officers wanting to volunteer. "It's not about pointing fingers," James explained to a group of community leaders who'd gathered to hear his perspective. "It's about reaching across the divide. These young officers, they want to serve their community. They just need to understand it better." Mrs. Chen had started keeping a notebook behind the counter, recording the stories people shared about James's impact on their lives. 20 years from now," she said, wiping happy tears from her eyes, "people will want to know how one Sunday morning changed everything." The police department took unprecedented steps. Captain Richardson announced a new training program, with James as a key advisor. "We're not just teaching procedures," the captain explained. "We're teaching understanding, empathy, and the kind of leadership that Mr. Wilson exemplifies." Local schools began calling, asking James to speak to their students, but he insisted on keeping his original commitment, starting with the Career Day presentation he'd been preparing when the incident occurred. This time, though, he had some unexpected company. The 2 officers who'd confronted him that Sunday morning asked to join him. They stood beside him as he spoke to the high school students, their presence a powerful testament to the possibility of change. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest learning," the second officer told the students, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Mr. Wilson taught us that dignity isn't just about how you handle respect, it's about how you handle disrespect. The community center where James volunteered saw a surge in participation. Young people who'd watched the video online came looking for guidance, drawn by the quiet strength he displayed. Police cadets started dropping by, hoping to learn from his example. The medal wasn't the most important thing they saw that day, Mr. Thompson reflected, watching the steady stream of people visiting his diner. They saw a man who chose understanding over anger, teaching over punishment. That's the real story. Local businesses joined the movement. The owner of the tech shop that had reported the laptop thefts came forward, not just to apologize but to donate computers to James's youth program. Other business owners followed suit, turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for community support. Mrs. Chen's grandson, now in college, called home after seeing the video. "Grandma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "now everyone knows what we've always known about Mr. Wilson. He didn't just help me get into college, he showed me what it means to be a leader." The diner itself became a symbol of transformation. The corner booth where the incident occurred became known as the Bridge Builders booth. Police officers and community members would sit there together, sharing coffee and conversations about making their neighborhood better. "Every Sunday morning," James said, looking around at the now bustling diner, "I came here for the quiet. Now look at what's happened." He smiled at the sight of young officers chatting with local teens, barriers breaking down over plates of Mrs. Chen's pancakes. The surveillance cameras that had captured the incident stayed up, but they now recorded a different story, one of a community coming together, of understanding growing in place of suspicion, of hope replacing fear. Bobby, still working his way through college applications, summed it up best. "Mr. Wilson always told us that true strength isn't about proving you're right. It's about being strong enough to help others learn and grow, even when they've wronged you." The afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the proud smile on Captain Richardson's face as he watched another group of his officers sitting down to learn from James. What had started as a moment of shame had become a masterclass in leadership, dignity, and the power of choosing understanding over anger. 6 months had passed since that fateful Sunday morning at Martha's downtown diner. The early morning sun still streamed through the same windows, but something fundamental had changed in the way it illuminated the space. The corner booth, where it all began, had become more than just a seat. It had become a symbol of transformation. "I never thought one morning could change so many lives," Mrs. Chen said, pouring coffee for James on another peaceful Sunday. The diner was quieter at this early hour, just like it used to be, but the energy was different. Pictures now lined one wall, photographs of community meetings, youth graduations, and police officers working side by side with local teens. James looked up from his usual spot, a small smile crossing his face. "Sometimes the hardest moments bring the best chances for change," he replied, watching as Bobby, now a freshman in college, handed out menus to the morning customers. The young man had earned a full scholarship, inspired by the events he'd witnessed that day. The police department had undergone its own transformation. Captain Richardson's new training program, developed with James's help, had become a model for other precincts across the state. The 2 officers who'd confronted James that morning were now leading figures in community outreach. "You know what's funny?" the taller officer had said during last week's youth mentoring session. "We thought we were protecting the community that day. Turns out we needed to learn what community really means." He sat in the diner now, not as an authority figure, but as a student of the very man he'd once wrongly judged. The youth mentorship program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started in James's corner booth now filled community centers across the city. Young people who'd once viewed police officers with suspicion were working alongside them, learning from them, and teaching them in return. "It's like watching a garden grow," Mr. Thompson observed, looking around his bustling diner. "You planted seeds of understanding that day, James. Now look at what's blooming." The diner had become more than a restaurant. It was a gathering place where barriers continued to break down over cups of coffee and shared stories. Local businesses had joined the movement in their own way. The tech shop that had reported the laptop thefts now ran free computer classes for neighborhood kids, taught by police officers in their off-duty hours. Other businesses followed, creating opportunities for community engagement that went far beyond their daily operations. Mrs. Chen's grandson, now helping other students with their college applications, often reflected on the change he'd witnessed. Mr. Wilson showed us that real strength isn't about power, he told a group of high school students. It's about turning difficult moments into opportunities to bring people together. The Congressional Medal of Honor that had revealed the truth that morning now sat in a small display case near the diner's entrance, not because James wanted to show it off, but because the community had insisted. Beside it, a simple plaque read, "Character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge." The medal was never the real story, James explained to a visiting journalist. The real story is what happens when people choose understanding over anger, growth over blame, when they realize we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. Bobby, during his college breaks, still worked his shifts at the diner. "You know what's amazing?" he said one morning, straightening his apron. "Kids come in here now asking to sit in the corner booth. They say it's where they learn about real leadership." The Sunrise crowd had changed too. Police officers and local residents who'd once viewed each other with suspicion now shared breakfast and conversation. Young people stopped by to get advice about their futures, finding mentors in both James and the officers who learned from him. "We could have let that morning divide us," Captain Richardson reflected, sitting across from James in the famous corner booth. "Instead, it brought us together in ways none of us could have imagined." The training program they developed went beyond traditional police work. It taught officers to see the community through new eyes, to understand that true protection meant building bridges, not walls. The two officers who'd confronted James that day now led these sessions, their own experience serving as a powerful testimony to the possibility of change. "Every morning when I open up," Mrs. Chen would say to new customers, "I remember that day. Not because of what went wrong, but because of what went right afterward. How one person's dignity showed us all a better way." The diner's wall of photographs kept growing. Pictures of graduation ceremonies where police officers cheered for the kids they'd mentored. Images of community events where barriers continued to break down. Snapshots of ordinary moments that showed extraordinary change. As another Sunday morning dawned, James sat in his usual spot, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. The laptop before him held plans for expanding the mentorship program to other cities, but his coffee had grown cold, too many people stopping by to share their stories, to thank him, to learn from him. "You know what the real medal is?" Bobby asked a group of younger kids who'd gathered to hear the story. "It's not the one in the case. It's what Mr. Wilson taught us all, that true heroism isn't just about one brave moment. It's about choosing to make things better every single day." The morning light filled the diner once again, touching everything with its warm glow. In that light, you could see more than just a restaurant. You could see hope taking root, understanding growing, and the quiet power of one person's dignity changing countless lives, one Sunday morning at a time.